We now continue Parmenides in the Eleatic school with his student Zeno of Elea, or Lea. Background for Zeno: he was born in 490 BC, died in 430 BC, and is of course still dead today. Zeno is probably best known for his famous paradoxes, in which he argues, quite logically and rationally, from plausible premises to a conclusion that in many cases seems totally insane and totally contrary to experience. So let's take a look at some of Zeno's arguments. One argument is the argument against the senses, and it rolls out like this. First, if you drop a single millet seed, or any seed of your choice that's not particularly big, say like a chia seed, like from a chia pet, it will make no noise. Technically, this is not true, because if you had a good enough microphone, you could hear it, but if you're just using your ears, probably won't hear it. Now, if you drop a bushel of these seeds, you'll hear the noise. So either the millet seeds make a sound when dropped, or they do not, which of course is a tautology. If they do not make a sound, as premise 1 purports, then our senses deceive us about premise 2. And if they do make a sound, then our senses deceive us about premise 1. Either way, we are deceived. Now, the argument, although seems superficially plausible, does have a clear problem. Namely, it seems to commit what's called the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition occurs when one assumes that what is true of individuals is also true of the whole. So, for example, if we take a group of basketball players who are all very good, and we infer that since they're all good players, they'll make a really good team, that could be true, but it's not an automatic inference. They could be not particularly good at working together as a team. Now, going back to the millet seeds, the problem here is this. While it could be true that an individual seed doesn't make noise, or barely any noise, that may be true of the individual, but clearly not true of the whole. I mean, you can make the same argument like a millet seed doesn't weigh much, therefore, a million of them don't weigh that much. And that doesn't create any contradiction, it's just a matter of addition. So that's his argument against the senses. Next argument, the arguments against plurality. And he had a bunch of these, about 40, but we'll just look at one. So let's see how this goes. The first premise is apparently intuitively and empirically obvious. Suppose there are many objects. Now, each object does require a specific size. And one of the long ongoing debates in metaphysics and physics is, are things infinitely divisible? In other words, suppose you had a magical sword that could cut anything in half, that could be cut. Could you just keep cutting forever, or do you finally hit the uncuttable thing, laying aside problems of size? Now, somewhat intuitively, if we have an object of any length, any size, then it can be cut up. And it can be cut in half, and half, and half, and so on. And so, here's how it reasons. If an object is made of an infinite number of parts, each with some size, then, by addition, the object itself must be infinite. And of course, that seems clearly absurd. And so what he infers is, there can only be one infinite object, so just one entity. Now, of course, a way to counter this would be to argue that there would be a point at which you could not cut any more. You'd hit the base entity. And one of the ongoing debates in metaphysics and physics is there a base entity, that is the smallest thing possible? And if that were the case, this argument would clearly fail, because you'd reach, the one tiniest thing that's, not infinitely divisible, and then everything is made up of those things. But not a terrible argument. Next is the classic paradoxes of motion. He is probably best known for these, and there are 4 variations of these. And here's how they go. Imagine you're trying to run a 5K. So you're trying to get from the start of the 5K to the finish line. Now, to do that, of course, to get from the start to the finish, you've got to first off travel halfway between the two. So halfway to the finish. So that would be 2.5 kilometers. Now, of course, before you can get to 2.5 kilometers, or rather, you'd have to get to half of that. And then, of course, half of that, and half of that, and half of that, off to infinity. And so, there'd be an infinite number of points to run. And given there's an infinite number of points, this would take an infinite amount of time. So, you can never finish that 5K. In fact, you couldn't finish any distance because it'd be infinitely divisible. And so, according to Zeno, motion is not possible, so nothing moves. And again, this rests on the notion of infinite divisibility, and of course our empirical experience, we can move, but an interesting paradox. And he had many other paradoxes as well. So, why were Parmenides, Zeno, etc., why were they important? Well, one thing is, they developed a logical philosophical method, and even though they, on some views, might have misused it. They also added a great deal to the classic debate between knowledge through reason and knowledge through senses. And these paradoxes and problems they created have been popular and analyzed for centuries. They weren't the absolute first to do this, but they began the method of considering the logical implication of words and concepts. And also, as the arguments show, they set a precedent for following arguments to their logical conclusions, even when these conclusions seem counterintuitive, perhaps even absurd. And so other philosophers, because of these pretty good arguments, such as Plato and Aristotle, had to address these problems. And later philosophers noted that they sort of did a pretty good job exposing the problem of making inferences from language, how we talk, to metaphysics, what there is. For example, classic example, take the word is, and its equivalent in Greek and other languages. This can be taken as a claim of existence. It can be a claim of identity. It can be a claim of predication. So if you say, for example, that, something is something else, that could be saying that it does exist. It can be saying it has a particular quality, and it can be claiming that it is that thing. So if you say, for example, the block is red, that could mean that it is, it is a predication, it has that quality, or it could oddly enough mean that the block is, in fact, redness itself. And these problems were addressed first by Plato in his classic dialogue, The Sophist. And that brings us then to the end of Parmenides and the Eleatic school and his student, Zeno.